Hello there! So, the initial reason for this channel was to offer some pushback against the most popular economics grifters out there right now. That's why it's called false profit. And right now, the most popular among them is self-titled
economist, mathematician and trader.
Gary Stevenson from Gary's Economics.
I'm one of the best economists in the fucking world at this, okay? I'm here to tell you what's happening.
I want to go over one of Gary's old videos here in a minute and show why he's either just wrong or straight up dishonest. But before that, let me just preface this. I do not have a problem with Gary's politics or policy. My main problem with Gary is that he keeps lying and he keeps making shit up. He doesn't listen to subject matter experts, he never provides any evidence, he doesn't believe in the data, certainly never shows any, and when pressed, he just insists it's all manipulated by evil elites. Because of this, a lot of Gary's videos just boil down to a very simplistic populist playbook. Step number 1. Make a vibes-based claim that you know resonates with your fans and provide no evidence whatsoever. Step number 2. Give an incredibly simplistic explanation. Make sure that inequality is the root cause of it and that wealth taxes are the best and the only solution to deal with the problem. Step number 3. Demonize the actual subject matter experts. They only disagree with you because they're part of the wealthy elite and want to keep the small man down. But let's demonstrate this with one of his own videos. It's called Why Growth is Stupid. And I'll put the link in the description if you want to watch the video yourself.
We hear these kinds of arguments all the time on the news, from the Conservative Party, sometimes even from the Labour Party. The problem with Britain is we're just not productive enough. We as Britons have a fundamental problem. Our productivity is lacking. We're sort of fundamentally weak. We need to fix productivity. And I have a problem with this way of describing the economy. And first of all, I'm not against productivity. I'm not against economic growth. I think these things are all good things. If fundamentally the biggest problem was a lack of UK productivity, number one, what we'd be seeing is living standards falling, specifically in the UK. And I think a lot of people who live in the UK feel that what we have is a specific UK problem. It's very important to recognise living standards are falling for middle classes all across the world. All across the world. So this YouTube channel is watched all across the world. We've got a lot of viewers in America, in Australia, in places like Germany, the Netherlands.
Alright, there we have it, the vibes-based claim. In this clip, Gary tells us that living standards all across the world are falling, but he doesn't produce any evidence to support that claim. Unfortunately, nowhere in this video does Gary provide any sort of definition of what he means by living standards, so I'm just gonna assume it's the standard material living standard definition that's used everywhere. That definition essentially boils down to income, more specifically real income. If you're not familiar with that term, real income is simply the amount of stuff that you can buy with your money. So it already accounts for things like inflation. So essentially, if this year you can buy more stuff than last year, your living standards have risen. Okay, but enough explanation, let's actually look at what the data has to say. This graph shows the growth in real median household disposable income since 2009 for the UK. In simple words, how much more stuff can a middle class household buy now than it could 15 years ago? So, as you can see from this graph, over the last 1.5 decades, UK households have actually seen about a 6% increase in their real disposable income, and that's also their living standards. So, while this is definitely not stellar, these are not great numbers, it's a far cry from saying that living standards are plummeting in the UK. Interestingly, most of this growth has actually gone to middle income earners, and if we correct for housing expenses, then the poorest 10% of the population have actually seen the highest growth in their incomes. So none of this effect can really be said to be driven by rich people or by inequality. Don't get me wrong, these numbers are pretty bad. British living standards are growing much slower than they did before, and they're also growing much slower compared to other European economies. But the point is, they are still growing. Living standards are not falling, not in Britain, and most definitely not all across the world. So already, this entire motivating section of the video is just entirely made up. It's not based in any facts, it's not supported by any evidence, it's literally just doomer vibes that he knows his fans will like. But it's not the only thing he gets wrong, so let's keep going.
If the fundamental problem in the British economy, or even the global economy, is a lack of productivity, why is wealth of the richest people in the country, the richest people in the world, millionaires and billionaires, why are these people's wealth exploding through the ceiling? So I'm sitting here now, we're filming this at the beginning of April. In the last couple of weeks, we have seen almost every single stock market in the entire world hit a new record all-time high. Does that sound like a world which has a problem of fundamental productivity growth?
Alright, so in this one, Gary essentially suggests that because the stock markets are at all-time high valuations, that there isn't a fundamental problem with productivity and productivity growth. But once again, we can simply look at the facts. People actually, measure this stuff and see that the UK does seem to have a pretty significant issue with productivity growth over the last 2 decades. This graph here shows productivity over time. Productivity is essentially just the output per hour worked, so how much value does an average worker produce in an hour, and it shows it for 3 economies. I choose Germany to have a European comparison to the UK and the US. In general, you can see that in 1995 the 3 countries were pretty much dead even, with Britain even pulling slightly ahead in the early 2000s. But at some point in the later 2000s, Britain seemed to fall back and has not been able to recover since. As real output per hour worked and real income are really closely related, this graph actually matches up really nicely with the slowdown in living standards growth that we've seen in the section before. If you compare the UK to similar economies, it becomes clear that it does have a problem with productivity growth. But once again, Gary doesn't seem to care about this because he doesn't care about the facts. But what about the second point you asked, the one about the stock market? Well, that one is actually kind of difficult to debunk, not because it's a strong argument in any way. There's just so much wrong with it, it's actually kind of hard to know where to start. The first thing that's wrong with the argument is that the stock market generally is a terrible meter for the economy. It doesn't care about past productivity growth, it doesn't care about current productivity growth, it is forward-looking. And also, there's just a ton of other things that can influence it. So you should be really careful when making any arguments about the real economy based on the stock market. The next thing that's wrong with it is that productivity growth, as the name implies, is a growth rate. The stock market is a level. What do I mean by this? If something grows every year by 2% and then it slows down to growing every year by 1%, it is still growing. So, thus, if the growth rate is positive, you would still expect it to reach an all-time high. Maybe to give an example, instead of growing 10% every year, the stock market started growing only 1% every year, you would still see an all-time high, just a lower all-time high. You would really expect self-titled mathematician Gary Stevenson to understand this elementary difference, but then again, I am not
Citibank's most profitable trader.
So what do I know? On a very related note, the stock market, unlike productivity, is not denoted in real terms. So this means even if your productivity level is completely stagnant, the stock market can reach all-time highs simply by inflation or currency devaluation. Coincidentally, the dollar, which is usually the standard currency used for denoting stock values, has recently lost a lot of its strength, which means all-time highs are kind of expected. Anyway, all this talk about foreign stock markets is a little bit besides the point, because the entire reason Gary is talking about this in the first place is this collapse in living standards, which we are supposedly seeing all around the world, which Gary seems to have entirely made up. This entire stock market section is spectacularly incoherent even for Gary's standards, and I suspect it just exists to drive home that it's rich people that are to blame for all your problems. Anyway, this is a little bit of a cross of point 1 and 2 from the playbook, so I'm just gonna give point 2 half a mark here. I'm sure Gary will provide us with a nice black and white summary at the end of the video, so we can cross the full thing.
I think we need to look a little bit closer at who this guy Mark Carney is, right? What you have here is a very wealthy man who has been very well paid throughout his career. I'm sure him and his family are all very rich. They are part of a class of very wealthy people who are getting richer very rapidly, whose living standards are increasing very rapidly, turning around to you and saying the problem is productivity. You guys are just not productive enough. And I think what we have here is one single example of a much broader problem, which is that economists and politicians, who very often are very rich, live in an economy which is seeing lifestyles of the very rich get fantastically better, seeing the wealth of the very rich explode very quickly, while your living standards collapse, turning around to you and saying that the problem is your productivity.
Well, finally we got point 3. So I can't really say too much about this, because what Gary is positing here is essentially a conspiracy theory. He says that because economists and politicians are obviously all wealthy, their goal is to stay wealthy or get even richer and keep the small man down, basically. To be honest, I think the goal of this is pretty obvious, and it's essentially just poisoning the well. It's an explanation why none of the experts agree with him and why he never has to cite any data, because the entire system is corrupt and against him. Perhaps one thing that should be said though is that economists as a general rule are not wealthy. I don't know where this misconception comes from, but economists are just academics. They work at universities, they get paid as other academics, which is a good living, but you're not gonna get spectacularly rich off of it. But at the end of the clip, he had another point, which I think is a pretty common misconception, and I wanna address it real quick, so let me replay that section.
Turning around to you and saying that the problem is your productivity.
Did you catch it? Gary says your productivity. Now, this might seem like a really nitpicky, really minor thing, but I think it's actually intentional and I think it's actually quite smart, narratively speaking. In economics, productivity is pretty much a neutral concept. Obviously, you want it to be higher, but it's not like a personal failing to have low productivity. But in a personal context, if someone were to call you unproductive, that is quite negatively loaded. And I think Gary intentionally muddles the common and the economic meaning of that term to provoke a negative reaction. Essentially, what he's trying to say is that the politicians and the rich people, they're calling you lazy. He even does it again and gets more emotional at a later point in the video.
And wealthy men, like Mark Carney, turn around and say it's because your productivity is not good enough. And we had a very similar example where Andrew Bailey, who is the current governor of the Bank of England, said that inflation is your fault for asking for higher wages. And Andrew Bailey is paid £500,000 a year.
So I actually get that this is quite confusing if you're not used to the economic use of the term. But usually when economists talk about productivity, they never talk about personal responsibility of the workers. It's almost always a structural issue. A classic example would be that your economy, for whatever reason, just fails to allocate its resources effectively. Let's give a really simple, concrete example. Let's assume we have a company with an office and two employees, let's call them Alice and Bob. Alice and Bob are office workers and they both need a computer to do their work. The company owns two computers and usually Alice and Bob each just have one computer. But then a new manager comes in and thinks he knows better. He decides Bob is way more productive, so Bob gets both of the computers. But Bob obviously still only has two hands and two eyes, so he can only work on one computer at the same time, and now Alice can't work at all. Now, the result is, with the same resources, you have just half the productivity of the company. And it's not the worker's fault, in this case it's the manager's fault, but this can also just be a structural issue that can have any sort of reason. Anyway, I think Gary probably knows all of this and he just purposely uses the confusion around the term to get people angry. I just wanted to clear it up because I think it's legitimately a bit confusing if you never heard of it.
Economists have a fundamental blind spot about inequality. What they are obsessed about is growth. And they will always be obsessed about growth. And they will always tell you that growth is the problem and lack of productivity is the problem. In my opinion, and I've got lots of videos where I hope I'll convince you, we have a fundamental problem of growing inequality. And what I see is a sick economy which has a growing cancer of inequality, going to the doctor and the doctor saying, listen, don't worry about your cancer, grow your way out of it.
He is laying it on thick here with the cancer analogy, but I think essentially this completes the playbook that we laid out at the start. In the end, he gives us a really simple explanation. It all boils down to inequality, big surprise, and there's really nothing else that could have caused it. So, to summarize, I think Gary's a grifter. He makes claims based on what he thinks will do well with his base, never gives any evidence for it. He provides a black and white explanation that always boils down to the same problem, inequality, and gives a one-stop shop solution. And he demonizes any voice that could disagree with him, any subject matter experts that might have a different opinion, and any data sources that go against his points by just claiming they're all corrupt or evil or part of some conspiracy, or they just want to become richer on the backs of poor people. Gary's economics basically deals exclusively in economic populism and misinformation. And the more popular this stuff becomes, the more space it takes away from legit discussions and legit solutions for the problem he discusses, which are real issues. This is not only online, but also politically. So I think it does have a real impact. All right, so this video has been long enough. And if you made it to this point and you just want one thing to take away, just know that Gary is a grifter. Don't listen to a thing he says.